Welcome back to another virtual tasting with Binny's. I'm Pat from the Whiskey Hotline, along with Joe. We are joined by our friend Francisco, who is going to talk to us about Mezcal Vago today. Cisco, you were on one of our Mezcal tastings before when we had that never-ending series of Monday night agave tastings, I think. But today we want to focus on one brand. So welcome back, man. We appreciate you taking the time tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's always great to connect with you guys. Chicago's always been one of my favorite markets to work. Just the enthusiasm that you all have for just kind of craft spirits in general, but then B, also the agave spirits. Honestly, some of my favorite kind of agave focused bars have always been in Chicago, and I've just had a really wonderful time whenever I'm in that area. So thank you all so much for spending some time with me this evening.
Anybody watching,
What's that?
Sorry, our connection's a bit choppy. Sorry.
Oh, okay. What I was going to say is, not just within the category, but really within our brand, I could talk for a couple hours straight. So I know that we're not going quite that long tonight, but I'm going to try and give you all a pretty good foundation of what we think sets Vago apart, why I've really enjoyed working with the brand so much, and really just kind of where we see ourselves going in the future, because last year did bring quite a bit of change for us, some of it planned, some of it not planned, and we'll definitely talk about that in just a moment. But we'll probably start by going back into the past about 10 or 12 years, and that really kind of sets the tone and sets the background for Vago. One of the things that's so unique about Vago is kind of the origin story. First of all, the organic nature of the origin story, and really the structure of the company and kind of how we grew. And I think it's one of the things that has really endeared people to the brand and really set us apart from some of the other brands that are out there on the market. And we're lucky that we have some really incredible relationships and some really incredible friends in the agave space from other brands, whether it be Del Maguey or Mezcal Tospa or something like that. It's a very tight-knit community. There's drama and things like that, as there is in any kind of, small microcosm of an industry. But that being said, I think we have really, really wonderful bonds with not just the producers that are in part of our family, but the producers that go across the category as well. But specifically to Vago, we are a brand that works with now 5 different producers based at 5 different locations. I'll probably start saying the word Palenque. So I want to start out by making it clear that when I say the word Palenque, I'm talking about the distillery, and in reality, the ranch or the home where each producer lives, because each Palenque is literally part of their home. It's right, it might be 100 yards or so away from their actual house, off to the side. But when I say Palenque, I'm talking about where we're living, where we're growing our food, where we're producing our mezcal. Okay, so that's what you kind of need to envision when I say that word. So we work out of 4 different Palenques. In one of those Palenques, there's 2 producers that we work with who are part of our family, and I'll talk about kind of how that's structured out in just a moment. But let me go ahead and start sharing this out. I have visuals if you all want them. I just need to have the capability to share the slideshow, and otherwise I can just verbalize. Thank you.
But right, you should be good now.
Yep, great. It's a lot more interesting, I think, if you have visuals rather than just my hat to kind of illustrate the brand. So you can see here we have thank you very much. I'm fond of it. We do have 4 different colored labels that make up the brand. When we started, we were working with 2 different producers. Everything was in this neutral colored kind of earth tone brown label you see all the way on the left. And as we grew the brand, we started working with more producers, each producer doing more than one expression. So as you can probably imagine, it got a little bit confusing. So right after I started working with Vago in about 2015, we actually started color coding each label according to each producer. So that's one way. If you're at a bar or something, let's say you're at a stereo or something and you have Mezcal Vago, right? And then you go to Binny's to try and find it on the shelf. You might not remember the name of that particular mezcal, but at least you know that if it had a blue label, you're going to get something from the same producer. So it's going to be a similar style, kind of a similar profile, same production method. Might be a little bit different because it might be a different type of agave, but at least you know that you're getting the same palenque, same location, same producer. And that's going to be really important as you start to branch out and try more mezcal. So that's one of the reasons that we wanted to do that, was just to help consumers pull it off the shelf and be a little bit more clued in to what they were getting. Because as the category has grown, there's so many different labels out there, so many different brands, and even just within Vago, as I mentioned, multiple producers making multiple expressions. But at least if you can stick with a producer, you're going to be pretty consistent, right? So that's one of the reasons that we started making that change. And that makes up what we kind of call our little billboard here, which really just pops. We have these really beautiful, beautiful artistically produced labels, which we'll talk about in a little bit, with these natural colored dyes. And it's just a really fascinating process. And we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. So I really like this slide that you see here. This really sets the tone for the way that we are producing Mezcal Vago, because this photo is about an hour and a half away from Oaxaca City, which is the capital of the state. Still a pretty small city by our standards, but definitely the largest city in the state. And then it's about another hour and a half up this Jeep road, which goes up this river canyon, before you even get to Aquilino's family's house, which is where we're producing most of the mezcal that falls under the Vago label. So very much kind of walking away from the urban centers, really getting lost in rural, mountainous Oaxaca. If anybody has been to Oaxaca, you already know this. If anybody hasn't, it's a very, very rugged state. And we'll look at a map in a minute. Right in the middle, you have what we call the Central Valley, which is this wide open space where a lot of the indigenous Zapotec culture was before the Europeans came. A lot of farming still goes on in those areas for obvious reasons, being open, wide open, flat, gets a lot of drainage and runoff from the mountains, very easy to work that land. But outside of that Central Valley, it's very, very mountainous. In the north, way up in the north towards Veracruz and Puebla, and also in the south towards the coast of Oaxaca, a lot of mountains, which is where we're producing most of the mezcal. So these tiny little hidden villages where all of these producers have lived for several generations, have really lived in balance with the land. We've been subsistence farmers for the most of our history. So growing all of our own food, corn, beans, squash, etc., really just living off the land, taking what it's willing to give us and figuring out how to exist in the middle of nowhere. And that's the way we're really producing this mezcal. We're continuing that tradition of rural campesino farm, self-sustaining farm lifestyle, while producing these really small batches of mezcal, the same way that we have been for several generations. So when I talk about Vago, I kind of tend to key in on four different things. The first one being family, along with sustainability, a little bit of transparency as well, and authenticity. Those four things kind of make up the pillars upon which we've really built the brand. Family, probably the most important. I mentioned that we work with 4 different palenques, 5 different producers, right? Out of those 5 different producers, 4 of them are all kind of connected to one central family. And this is the family you see here, which is the Garcia family. In the middle of this photo is the patriarch of Mezcal Vago, the gentleman who's responsible for it all, along with Judah Cooper, who is the other gentleman in this photo all the way on the right. The 2 of them started the brand with Judah's best friend Dylan in 2012. Aquilino Garcia Lopez is a 5th generation mezcal producer and also happens to be the father-in-law of Judah Cooper. My boss, Judah, is the guy all the way on the right over here. He's originally from Colorado. That's where he met his business partner, Dylan, several decades ago. They were both just kind of ski bums working the ski resorts around Telluride. They would work all winter, save up all their money, and then they would go on these adventure trips, whether it be mountaineering or surfing and things like that, all summer, blow most of the money they worked all winter for, then go back to Colorado, work another winter season, save up all their money, and go on another trip. It was on one of these trips that Judah found himself in a tiny little town called Chicagua, or Lagunas de Chicagua. It's actually a nature preserve that is about an hour and a half north of Puerto Escondido. And sorry about that. The nature preserve is, now I can't get rid of this. Sorry guys, give me just a moment here. Let me close that out. There we go. So the nature preserve is about an hour and a half north of Puerto Escondido, which is a really well-known surf town But Lagunas de Chicagua is a little bit more of a local spot, kind of under the radar. So that's how Judah kind of found this village, was just asking around and found a really good surf break. Well, he had a really bad ear infection in this tiny little town. And sure enough, it got bad enough that he had to go to the local clinic. And in these tiny little towns, there aren't really even doctor's offices. There's just these municipal clinics that are usually staffed by nurses. And then once or twice a week, the doctor will come through, treat the more serious cases, and then move on to the next town. So it was in this clinic that Judah met Valentina, the nurse who was in charge. She had just graduated from nursing school in Oaxaca City, was engaged to a gentleman who was living back in Oaxaca City, but that didn't stop Judah from falling in love pretty much instantaneously the moment he met Valentina. The way that he tells the story is that it was love at first sight, but unfortunately it does not work both ways. She was obviously engaged to somebody else, but that didn't stop Judah, because when you're young and in love, you're very hard-headed and do kind of stupid things. So he spent the whole summer trying to get her to go on a date with him. Finally, she relented, and they ended up going on a date, a few dates. And then this guy came back from Oaxaca City, understandably pretty pissed off. And the way that Judah tells the story is that Judah hatched this plan wherein he would challenge this guy to a fist fight for a little bit to maintain their honor. And he would lose the fight on purpose so that the guy could go back to Oaxaca City, maybe a little heartbroken because he had lost his fiance, but at least he would have a little bit of his dignity because he got to, extract.
And he won't come back and stab him. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So whether it was on purpose or not, sure enough, Judah got his butt kicked. The guy went back to Oaxaca City, but Judah and Valentina stayed in this tiny little town and opened up a little surf shack, just doing like ceviche, fish tacos, sand floor, palm roof, really just serving all the surfers that were passing through and some of the Mexican tourists that would travel there to go see the lagunas or whatever. And eventually they started buying mezcal from Valentina's father, who lived about 3 hours back into the mountains away from the coast. They would drive in in a truck, buy mezcal, bring it back to the restaurant, and start selling it to all the people that were passing through. And eventually, the little restaurant got known for having this really wonderful mezcal, and people would pass through just to try mezcal. So Aquilino was a very, very intelligent guy. He always had a really wide-angle lens and could really see the potential for his mezcal. So he had actually been pushing Judah for a while to start exporting mezcal to the States. And a couple years later, Valentina and Judah had a daughter, and the restaurant really wasn't providing enough money. So that's when we started Mezcal Vago. It was in the year 2012 that we sent our very first batch of mezcal to the US. When we launched the brand, I think I mentioned briefly, but you might not have picked up on it. At that time, when we started, we were working with two producers, Aquilino, obviously, who was at the center of it all. And then Aquilino's other daughter actually married a gentleman, and his uncle was also a mezcalero, and that's how we met Tío Rey. Well, his full name is Solomon Rey Rodriguez. We call him Tío Rey for short. But when we started the brand, we were selling mezcal from Aquilino and from Tío Rey. So it was the two producers, Judah and Dylan, who started this brand all together. So kind of a loose family connection with Tío Rey, obviously a very strong family connection between Judah and Dylan, or between Judah and Aquilino. So that is really why family is so central to what we've always done at Vago. We've grown very, very slowly because we have a very strong relationship with these producers. We don't want to overexert them. We don't want to overextend them and, God forbid, exploit them in any way. We really want to make sure that they're happy doing what they want to do, producing as much mezcal as they want to produce, and not putting the balance, the equilibrium that they're living in with the environment around them, right? So we've grown very slowly, very, very deliberately, and really just because family is so important to what it is that we do at Vago. So here you see Judah and Dylan right here. That's his business partner on the right, Judah on the left. And then I mentioned, along with family, we also really focus on authenticity, transparency, and sustainability. We know that people very often, or it's very rare that people have the opportunity to travel to Oaxaca, visit the Palenque, visit Aquilino's family, the Garcia family, or visit Tío Rey, get to sit at the table with them, sip mezcal, sit out by the stills at night as we're distilling, sip that mezcal off the still. And we really want to bring that experience back home to all of you. So that's why we really try and preserve the quality and the integrity of the spirit in the bottle. And we do that by not over diluting, not putting any additives in pre or post distillation, whether it be to help with fermentation or flavor the profile of the mezcal or what have you. We really try and be as authentic in the style of mezcal that we're producing as we possibly can. So that's why we also have a slightly higher proof. Everything we're going to try this evening is between 48 to 53% ABV. And again, no additives pre or post distillation. Transparency, if you've ever picked up a bottle of Vago, you know we put a lot of information right there at your fingertips, the name of the producer, where they're producing, the type of agave, when it was produced, how big the batch size was, etc. And then if you go onto our website or our company blog at masmezcal.com, there's even more information about how we produce the mezcal, about each producer, where it is that they live, the environment around there, because it can be a very intimidating category for people. It's from a different part of the world. There can be a huge language barrier. Some of the, the plants, the process is all very different from most other spirits. So we really want to bring down those walls a little bit and make it as accessible to people as we can. And we do that by maintaining a pretty strong sense of transparency. And then finally, sustainability, as you can probably pick up on the way that I've been speaking about the equilibrium, living in harmony with the environment. We really want to take care of the land around us. This land has provided for these families, kept them alive in the middle of nowhere for hundreds of years, generation after generation. And the last thing we want to do is throw that into jeopardy. So we really work on taking care of the land, whether it be by, like this photo illustrates, this is 4,000 Tobala plants that we planted by hand in order to replenish the wild population. Or the runoff, we just put in a 3-stage filter at our new Palenque in order to filter the vinaza, which is the runoff from the stills that can be very acidic, very hot, a lot of weird kind of compounds in the water. Mm-hmm. So we put a 3-stage filtration system to neutralize that acid, clean out some of those contaminants, and then we recycle the gray water around the garden that we have around the Palenque. So incorporating things like that in order to make sure that we're being good stewards of the environment around us. So just to summarize that, this is kind of what we think really sets us apart. Working with really small batches on small family farms, as I mentioned, right? Each one of the producers are 3rd to 5th generation producers. It's the first time that they had ever exported, and we're still the only brand that they work with, which we're very honored to say. Good. I mentioned the high proof alcohol content, and also we're really proud of the fact that the Mezcaleros still have ownership of the company. So a couple of years ago, we partnered with a company called Samson & Surrey. So luckily, we didn't have to sell the entire brand. So the producers still own shares of the brand that they're working with, which is not very common in the mezcal industry. In addition to that, what's really cool about working with Samson & Surrey is now each one of the producers actually owns shares in the other brands that are part of the Samson & Surrey portfolio. So there's about 6 brands. Some of you guys might know Few, for example, out of Evanston. They're one of our sister brands. And now the producers actually own a small part of Few as well, for example. So that's really great because that kind of diversity of ownership for Mezcaleto is virtually unheard of, which we're really, really proud to say, because that really ensures the long-term sustainability of not just the environment, right, but also at the human level, and giving these guys long-term financial stability, which for most of them is a first, right? They no longer have to just rely on a good crop in order to be able to feed their family. Now we're able to ensure that their sons and their grandsons are going to have opportunities that maybe they didn't have previously. So we're really, really proud of that. This is a really wonderful kind of breakdown of the 4 different mezcaleros that we work with. Well, now 5, I apologize. I'm going to keep going between 4 and keep bouncing back and forth between saying 4 and 5. I'm so used to saying 4, but unfortunately we lost Acalino very unexpectedly early last year. However, we are very proud to say that his sons, Temo and Mateo, are now carrying on his legacy. They both live on the same family farm. They've been working with Acalino for the past 2 or 3 years, longer than that, really, essentially since they started growing up. And now they've kind of stepped into the forefront, running the family ranch, running the Palenque together, and producing mezcal, but still in the exact same location where they grew up and learned to make mezcal from Acalino. So Temo and Mateo all the way on the left. Tio Rey is the next one down the line. In 2015, we started working with Amygdio Harakin, who lives in a village called Miahuatlan. And in about late 2016, early 2017, we started working with Joel Barriga, who lives relatively close to Acalino. Actually, Joel Barriga's wife is cousins with Acalino's wife, which is how we were first introduced to them. So, the family extension might be large, and it might be kind of distant relatives that we're working with, but we still feel very, very much, very, very connected to these guys. The one exception is Amygdio, who's really just a really wonderful friend of ours who makes incredible mezcal, and we've been very, very lucky to be working with him for almost 6 years now. This also shows kind of a rough outline of how they're producing, how they're grinding their agave, what type of still they're using, what their water source is, which is really important when we're talking about flavor profile, and what we consider to be their signature expression, if you will. So the first one that we have up this evening is the Espaline from Amygdio Harakin. So that's the first one that we're going to be tasting. This really is one of my favorite Espaline expressions. Mezcals from Miahuatlan, they tend to be a little mineral driven, a little saline. There's a couple of reasons for that. Amygdio's distillation process tends to have a slightly early cut to it, so it really cleans out some of that back end. That's one of the things that Vago has always really been known for, is having kind of a lighter profile, especially amongst people who are new to the category and really expect mezcal to be overwhelmingly smoky. They're really kind of taken aback by how light and really elegant Mezcal Vago is, whether we're talking about Acalino and Temo Mateo's mezcals, or Amygdio's, or Joel Barriga's. They really tend to be very light on the back end. Theo Rey's mezcals tend to be a little earthier, a little funkier, not necessarily smokier by any means, because all 5 mezcaleros that we work with don't really roast their agave for a terribly long period of time. And we'll talk a little bit about the production process in a moment. I'm going to go a little bit quicker than I typically go because I think you guys are already relatively familiar with the mezcal category and the steps
relatively thirsty. So thirsty.
Yeah, that's another good point. So that's being said, let's go ahead and dive in there. We're starting out with Amygdio's Espadine. This guy won this. When I say this guy, this mezcal won double gold, which is not quite as impressive as the fact that it actually won best overall mezcal at the San Francisco Spirits Competition back in 2019. And award competitions rather for spirits can be kind of hit or miss, and it can be very polarizing. But overall, we were really just excited about the fact that we had something to give Amygdio to show them how well the mezcals were being received in the States, because there's so few people that really get the chance to go down to Oaxaca and meet Amygdio, shake his hand, say hello. Yeah. So he doesn't necessarily always get to see the incredible feedback that we get to see. So it was really great to have something concrete and tangible to share with him, to show him how incredible, how well the mezcals are being received.
This is so fruity and elegant on the nose, but then initially on the palate though, it's creamy and it's full, but it's not, like you had mentioned though, it's clean. It's just clean. It's so clean. Really an impressive mezcal for the body of it, and it does not taste at all like it's 51% alcohol. That's crazy for an unaged spirit of that proof to drink this. You hate to use the word smooth, but I don't know what else to call it.
That's so funny that you say that, because I kind of feel the same way. I know so many bar professionals who roll their eyes when people say the word smooth, etc. But for people who aren't that familiar with spirits, their overall vocabulary is somewhat limited, and that's okay. We just got to kind of incorporate, just teach some other words. But the fact that you call something smooth still means something, right? It doesn't necessarily take any meaning away from the fact that you're calling something smooth. So I really totally agree with you and understand that, there's something to be said when you taste a spirit that does have that particular proof to it, and you don't realize that you're drinking something that is 51, 52, or even 53% ABV.
Now, the batch we're tasting right now was 565 liters, which, to put that in perspective, is such an incredibly minuscule amount. What is that? 150 gallons or something? We're working on such a small scale here, even compared to the American craft industry where, somebody's got this small still and it might be 500 gallons.
Yeah, right. And that's one of the things that I think really blows people away is that, you hear small still and you don't realize how small it is. Like even the copper stills that we're using, which are larger than the clay pot stills, which we'll talk about in a moment, those ones tend to be 250 to 300 liters, which are tiny little stills, and really the largest batches that we're changing a little bit because we did build a larger palenque for the boys. That was kind of the long-term vision, was that at the Garcia family ranch, we were going to build a larger palenque where Aquilino and Temo and Mateo were all going to work together, right? Unfortunately, that didn't work out quite the way we envisioned it. But, we're making slightly larger batches. But that being said, the largest batches that we've produced so far are maybe 12 to 1,300 liters, which are still pretty small batches of mezcal. And we're still
small batches of anything. I mean, look at these like limited release whiskeys that people chase down that have, 18,000 bottles or whatever. I mean, you're talking this whole batch is 780 bottles. It's crazy.
And honestly, we do batches that are down to maybe 100 liters as some special releases and stuff like that. So we're talking about just a handful of cases for an entire batch. And a lot of times these are expressions that have been up to this point only produced once. Not to say we might not make that batch again in the future, but at that point in time, that is a one-off batch, which is really, really remarkable that there's only, 10, 20, 25 cases of something available.
Crazy. Exclusivity. It's what everybody wants.
Yeah, that is what everybody wants, right? Absolutely. Joe, I do see your question here, man. Let me get to the next mezcal, and then we'll address that. So I am going to touch on something that we don't have tonight because it is on the way to you guys, which is really cool. And I'm really excited about it. And just because we tasted an Espadine right now, that's why I want to bring it up right now well. So this is a 100% Espadine en barro. All right. So we do have something from Tio Rey on the sheet tonight that is an ensemble, which is slightly different. And we'll talk about that when we get there. This is a 100% Espadine, which if you know a lot about mezcal, you probably know that Espadine is the most common agave variety for mezcal production. But for Tio Rey, it's not very common that he does pure Espadine expressions. He's usually doing a blend of different agave. So we're really excited because he makes this batch maybe once, twice a year, not even twice a year, probably about once every 18 months or so is when he makes this Espadine en barro. So this will be coming to you guys here in the next few weeks. It is a pure Espadine expression that is crushed by hand rather than with a tahona. So Amygdio, if you looked at that sheet that we had up before with each one of the producers on it, Amygdio is crushing with a stone tahona and distilling in copper. Tio Rey, as you can see here, is grinding everything by hand with canoa maso. So canoa is the wooden base that's hollowed out on the ground that we put the agave in. And then maso are wooden mallets that he uses to manually crush the agave. It takes him about 4 times as long to crush the same amount of agave as it would with a tahona.
And he doesn't extract as much sugar in that process, right? I mean, it's a less efficient method. Not only is it all sweaty too.
It's definitely a less efficient method, but he is thorough enough that he does usually get the same amount of exposure, of cellular exposure that you would get with tahona, right? But it does take him that much more labor and that much more time to get to that point, right? And it also, I think, tends to produce a slightly, I don't know if it's my head telling me this, just given my previous background in wine or what, but in my mind's eye, I imagine it being a little bit of a greener mezcal because you're breaking those cell walls a little bit more kind of violently rather than gentle pressing them, right? And I always think of pressing grapes, whereas, where the more, for lack of a better term, the more aggressive your method of pressing those grapes, the greener and more vegetal your wine's
Yeah.
probably going to come out because of the way that you're breaking those cell walls, right? And I see that same thing happen in Tio Rey's mezcals. And then also the distillation is a little bit different. Whereas Amygdio is using these 250-liter copper pots, Tio Rey is double distilling. They're both double distillations, but Tio Rey is actually doing it in these tiny little 45 to 50-liter clay pot stills. Tends to be a little bit of a funkier, earthier expression of Espadine. Going to be a little bit more savory, a little bit more acidic versus the minty citrus quality that you get from Amygdios. Also, Amygdio has a really mineral-rich water source. And because of that water source being so mineral-driven, you get a little bit of the minerality on the finish of the mezcal. And you also get a little bit of kind of salinity. And because of that, this particular expression, the Espaline from Amygdio, tends to be one of my favorite to pair with raw seafood, ceviche, sushi, things like that. Anything from a raw bar, oysters on the half shell, really, really wonderful. I know sometimes people will actually get like a little eyedropper of Isla Scotch and add that to their oysters. This particular expression of mezcal, and really anything from Amygdio, is a really, really wonderful complement to those oysters. I highly encourage people to try that at some point. So this map here is, am I sharing with you guys? I don't think I am, actually. Give me just a moment here. Start the screen share again. Great.
Okay, you're a bit delayed.
So that's the label that you guys have there with the Espaline and Barro. Wait, shoot, I got myself out of order here somehow. How did that happen? Odd. I apologize. Backtracking a little bit. There we go. So this illustrates where it is that we're producing everything. So Sola de Vega is where Tio Rey lives. Miahuatlan is where Amygdio lives. And Candelaria Yegolé is where Temo and Mateo live. And Joel Barriga, the fourth producer that we work with, also lives very close to this village of Yegolé. What you can't really see here on the map is the topography, which is kind of important. So the Central Valley, as I mentioned, kind of starts north of Oaxaca City, goes around Oaxaca City and encompasses it, and stretches down kind of to the south central part of the state. Now, such that Miahuatlan is in the foothills, so kind of rolling hill topography, right? Right before you get into the coastal mountains that run all along the southern coast of Oaxaca here, right? Around Puerto Escondido. So it kind of wraps around Miahuatlan in a horseshoe or a cul-de-sac and makes this kind of natural barrier for Miahuatlan. So it's kind of nestled in the foothills right before you rise up into the mountains. That means that Sola de Vega and Candelaria Yegolé are both in the actual more mountainous terrain. And that being said, they're in two very different environments, because what happens is that the moisture, all the storms from the Pacific, will blow in from the western coast, dump in Sola de Vega, make it a very hot, humid, tropical environment, and then everything else behind it is in this big rain shadow. So in Sola de Vega, you have mountains, but humid, tropical environment. In Yegolé, you have mountains, but very hot, arid environment. And then in Miahuatlan, you have that gentle rolling hillsides, but still very hot desert climate, very similar to Yegolé. And those hot, dry climates tend to produce lighter, brighter, kind of high-tone mezcal versus the tropical environment of Sola de Vega, which, because of the yeast and the bacteria in the air being a little bit different because of that tropical environment, tends to produce more acidic, kind of funky, earthy profile. And we'll taste that at the end when we try the Ensamble en Barro. So this really illustrates the terrain. You can see in the back here, very, very dry. Now, Yegolé is a village town, or excuse me, a river village. So right along the river is where the town's located. It's very green, very lush. But once you get 200, 300 yards away from that river, it really dries out. You start seeing columnar cactus, Palo Verde, mesquite. I'm joining you tonight from Southern Arizona, and it looks pretty similar to what we have here in Tucson. This is at the top of the mountains, up on the mesas where we grow all the agave. You can probably tell these mountain slopes are way too rugged and steep to really grow a lot. So we actually grow the agave way up on the top of the hillsides here with that really beautiful, beautiful sun exposure. A lot of people ask about our farming practices. I say we're little o organic. We're practicing the same natural farming techniques that our ancestors practiced. So no chemicals no fertilizers, no herbicides, pesticides being added to the soil or anything like that. We're not biodynamic certified or anything. We're just in reality natural organic farming, even though we don't have the certification. Everything is hand harvested. And sometimes we are in fact using animals because the terrain is too rugged to get a truck up there or build a road up into the fields. So we'll use an animal to bring the agave back down to the trucks, and then we'll load up the trucks, bring it back to the palenque and dump it off here where we start the roast. Roasting for about 4 or 5 days underground until we have this really beautiful, rich, roasted agave character that we have is what we're looking for. We don't want to over roast the agave. We don't want to burn the sugars because that's going to lower our yield. It's going to produce an earthier, smokier mezcal. We don't want to undercook the agave because then we're not getting a full conversion of those sugars from the starches in the plant. We're going to lose yield that way. And it's also going to produce a greener mezcal. I mentioned earlier the stone crushing, right? Temon Mateo, Amygdio, Joel Barriga, all crushing with a tahona. Tio Rey crushing by hand with wooden mallets. Open air fermentation, 2 or 3 days dry, and then we'll add river water, well water, spring water, depending on whatever water source the producer's using. And that's how we're doing our fermentation. No yeast being pitched, no additives to the fermentation whatsoever, just open air fermentation. And that's why I talked about the hot, drier climates, similar ecosystems, similar environments, producing similar bacterial profiles, yeast populations, etc. So those are going to give you kind of similar, brighter, lighter, high tone style of mezcal versus the tropical environment producing something that's a little funkier, a little earthier. Copper pot distillation for Temon Mateo and Joel and Amygdio, which is, I think, a perfect place to try the elote because it's in the distillation process that we find what separates the elote. So let's go ahead and dive into that. This is kind of the calling card for the brand. This is the family baby, if you will. This is really the mezcal that has helped build Mezcal Vago as a brand.
It was definitely the first Vago I ever tasted.
Most people, you know, over the course of the year, we do 12, 13 different expressions from the different producers. But year after year, elote continues to be maybe 35 to almost 40% of what we sell. It's unique. We're the only people who produce this particular style. It's approachable, both from a flavor perspective and from a wallet perspective, which sometimes is even more important for a particular consumer. And it's really, really beautiful, soft, enjoyable mezcal. So it's a 100% Espadine. We take dried, toasted corn, and then we add it to the still during the second distillation. It's the exact same corn that we grew in the fields. You can see it here growing next to the agave plants. It's the same corn that we will soak overnight in a quicklime in order to nixtamalize it and soften it so that we can grind it for all of our masa, for our tortillas. It's the same family. It's the same corn that's kept the family alive for hundreds of years. But with the elote, with this particular expression of mezcal, rather than nixtamalizing the corn, we'll keep it dry, and then we'll put it on the comal, which is the big clay grill where we make all of our tortillas and do most of our cooking. Just so it toasts it a little bit, gives it a nice little bit of color, gives it a really nice nuttiness to it, especially in the aroma. And then we'll literally take that dried corn, dump it right in the still during the second run. So what happens is, because during the toasting process, the oil from the corn kind of gets pulled out closer to the surface. And then once we add it to the mezcal, that oil from the corn diffuses into the spirit and just gives it a really nice, soft profile, creaminess to the palate, a little bit of nuttiness on the nose, which I mentioned earlier, a very unique profile, and just kind of heightens the experience of drinking the Espadine.
It is so good. This mezcal just never disappoints. I love the creaminess of it. It's pronounced, but it's not flabby, you know?
I really love the elote for that exact reason. The way you just said, it's not flabby, right? It's oily and heavier, but it's not cloying. It really works wonderfully in a stirred cocktail as well. When I was running a bar program in Houston, obviously Texas being a very whiskey-driven market, doing a split-base old-fashioned with a corn whiskey in the elote, or even an ounce of tequila and an ounce of elote in an old fashioned or something like that. Really, really wonderful gateway cocktail for a lot of whiskey drinkers to get into the category.
Hey, Cisco, our buddy Craig here wants to know what you guys do with the corn post distillation, which I've never asked.
We actually don't do too much with it because it doesn't have a ton of use. We will leave it out to the side. We will let it dry out, and then we'll blend it in with some of the cattle feed that we will put out for the animals to eat. And Joe, answering your question earlier, that is always changing as the cuisine of Oaxaca has been heightened largely through, it's always been wonderful, high concept cuisine in its own right. But once the presentation and stylization of it has been elevated a little bit, as more tourism has come to Oaxaca, you're seeing it paired with the cuisine more. Historically, it wasn't necessarily part of the culinaria of Oaxaca, if you will. It was really kind of apart from it. It was paired sometimes, but now you're more and more, you're seeing it incorporated into tasting menus and things like that. Whereas historically, it was really much more utilitarian than that. It was really just something for the common man to drink, right? Which isn't to say something for the drunks or anything like that, but it was the campesino's drink. It was the farmer's drink. And that was really the way it was approached. You would go to a bar, you would get maybe they have these really wonderful little 8-9 ounce beers. You would get one of those beers and drink that alongside with like a half pour of mezcal. And that's how you drink. Or you'd be at the palenque, as I mentioned earlier, just sitting around the still or after a meal and have a mezcal, or it was part of a celebration or things like that. It served a lot of purposes. Deliberately pairing into the dining experience wasn't necessarily one of them until I would say probably the last 15 to 20 years. As far as the food, the fuel for the roasting, it really depends because we are pretty, again, to use the word utilitarian, it really depends on what wood is available to us, because we're really trying not to cut any live wood. We're looking for deadfall, things like that. So it really depends on whatever wood is available to us. Because of the environment, it's predominantly Mexican black oak, some mesquite as well. Once you move up into the north, like Sonora, not too far from where I am, it's predominantly mesquite. There isn't a ton of oak just because of the environment. Durango as well, it's a lot more mesquite driven, less oak driven. Really kind of just depends on the environment. But where we are, we're not really too dedicated to only using one particular type of wood. It really just depends on what's available to us.
Excellent.
Awesome. So this is an illustration of the clay pot stills. So this is kind of the typical copper pot still that people might be most familiar with, where you have a boiler pot and then a condensation tube coming out of the top of it, right? This is a completely self-contained distillation vessel here. We call it a modified Filipino still. Not long after the Spanish crossed Mexico and reached the Pacific coast, they started importing slave labor from the Philippines across the Pacific, landing in the area around Acapulco, et cetera, a little bit further north, and then eventually moving their ports down the coast. Now, those slaves would bring this technology, which originated around China, we believe, and then migrated down to the Philippines. They would bring this knowledge with them, escape from the slave camps, go hide out in the mountains in the rugged terrain with the indigenous communities where it was very hard to access, and then that knowledge would just get disseminated through word of mouth, through experience, etc., and eventually became ingrained in the mezcal culture there. So this is a 2-chamber pot. You have a boiler on the bottom, and then this is your condensation vessel up top here. From the back, this shot is from the back of the still on the left. So you can see the fire pit there that sits underneath these bricks, heats up what we call tepache, T-E-P-A-C-H-E, will boil away the alcohol. It will evaporate up into this top chamber. You can see this wooden beam running through the top of the photo. That's constantly being fed with cold water, which is dumping into this stainless steel cap, keeping that cap cool. That will allow the mezcal to condensate once it hits that cap, because that's being fed out the back, right? Which allows the water to be kept cool rather than heating up. So that cap is going to be very, very cold. The water hits it, it'll condense and then fall back into the still where we have an agave leaf hanging, and that agave leaf catches every single drop of mezcal and then feeds it into these reed tubes. And that's how Tío Rey actually collects all the mezcal off of these clay pot stills. Because of the nature of the clay pot distillation, comes off of the still at a little bit lower proof. You get more evaporation through the seals and stuff like that. So you get a lower proof coming off the still. So everything that's distilled in clay is actually distilled to proof. So we don't add any water post-distillation with the clay pots, whereas the stuff coming off the copper pot stills is 58, 60, 65% ABV. So we have to add water to that mezcal in order to get it down to final bottling proof.
This is arguably one of the most unadulterated, just natural state distilled spirits you can drink. Honestly,
Absolutely.
Made by hand on clay.
Nothing more made by hand. From just picturing guys beating the crap out of agaves to crush the juice out of them. It's one of my favorite stories to tell customers on the sales floor at any of our stores about Tío Rey and, you know, the whole ancestral mezcal thing anyway, but we have Tío Rey examples at least. And people's jaw drops when you tell them about this stuff. And to have something that's made like that, with that level of just ancestral artistry, and it's on the shelf for around $100, that's ridiculous. And that's absolutely ridiculous.
Is how great it tastes too, because I've had a lot of customers take this bottle home based on that story, telling how it's made, and then they come back for another one because it tastes so amazing. It's just really complex spirit to drink.
Such a fun spirit to talk about.
Definitely, especially when we're talking about Tío Rey's, and I don't want to I don't want to jump ahead of myself here. So we'll talk about it in a moment. But especially when they come back for the ensemble and find something different, I'll talk about what I mean in just a moment. That I think makes it even more interesting. One of the cool things, kind of touching on the rusticity of mezcal, is that we're not measuring anything before it comes off the still. Occasionally, we will measure our bricks or something like that, but for the most part, it's all sensory perception. It's taste, it's smell, it's visualization, which you can see in this slide here. This is how Aquilino checks the proof as the mezcal comes off the still. Based on where the balance is at that point in the distillation of water versus alcohol, that's going to give a specific surface tension to the mezcal at particular ABVs, right? And that tension will change as the ABV changes. So based on that, how big these bubbles get as he aerates the still, we call them perlas or pearls, how big those bubbles are, how long they hold their shape, what patterns the bubbles make, whether they're big or large and clumped together. That's how he's able to read these bubbles, these perlas coming off the still, and along with taste, allows him to know exactly when to make the cuts on his still.
Something else, man.
Hey, on the before we get too far away from those clay pot stills, do you have to replace those very often? I was wondering, like the lifespan of clay versus copper.
Great question.
It really depends on the producer and the quality of the pot. They can last a handful of years. A long life expectancy for one of these pots will be 5 to 6 years. But if it's somebody who isn't very deliberate in how they're taking care of these pots, if they don't cool them down gradually, if they don't empty them carefully, you can nick them and break them, thermal shock, etc. So sometimes it can be a couple months, but if you're careful with them, they can last you, maybe a half dozen years or so before you have to replace them.
Is there an industry that manufactures those, or are those mostly made by the distiller?
That's a great question, man. ceramics is probably even more ingrained into the culture of Oaxaca than mezcal is, to be honest with you. And each particular village has their own style of pottery. The particular pots that are used for mezcal production typically, not always, come from a village called Santa Maria at Zompa, which is actually at the base of Monte Alban. And what's really cool about that village is that it actually used to be the main clay mill or ceramic mill for Monte Alban, 500 years, or not 500 years before, but for the entire, basically, Monte Alban civilization that existed before the Europeans got there. So Zompa has a ceramics tradition that goes back 1,000 years, if not longer, and they're still making clay pots to this day. And that's where most of the pots for clay pot distilled mezcal is coming from.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's really, really interesting because, some particular villages produce that black clay that's very famous from Oaxaca. This is not that type of clay. Zompa doesn't make that kind of clay. Different villages have different types of clay, different patterns, different ceramic vessel shapes that they make. It's really, really interesting, the ceramic tradition in Oaxaca.
And those copper pot stills that are used, those made at the Palenque, or are they? Is there somebody that manufactures those smaller ones too?
No, the copper pot stills are usually made by a handful of families who have a kind of like mezcaleros, have kind of a multi-generational tradition of producing copper pot stills. There's a town called I can't remember the first part of the name, but we just call it Ocotlan, which is on the way to Candelaria Yegolé, where they produce a lot of copper pot stills. There's a couple other villages as well. Depending on what part of Oaxaca you're in, there's usually one town in that area that has a coppersmith that will make the stills for you. So these are getting in. So now we kind of ran through the production process. Now we're just looking at some of the other types of agave that we work with. This is Agave Espadine, as we mentioned, very common for mezcal production. About 80% of what you see on the market comes from that type of agave. It's got the best combination of a handful of variables: how large the plants get, how quickly they come to maturation, how much starch there is in the plant, which is what we're converting into sugar when we roast the agave, right? We're breaking those starches down into sugar. So more starch you have, the better your yield is going to be. They're very disease resistant. And probably most importantly, they produce a lot of clonal plants or pups. One mother plant will give you anywhere between 10 to 20 clonal plants at 3 or 4 years of age. You can harvest those clonal plants, replant them in the ground, and the mother plant will continue to grow to maturity, at which point you can harvest it for mezcal production. So it's a very efficient reproduction method for agave agriculture. We also have Megicano, which we're going to try in just a moment, which is part of the Rhodocantha family. Only takes about 5 to 8 years to mature. Has a little bit of a lighter flavor, lower starch content, so a little bit of a lower yield. Quiche as well is a very dry, dusty style of mezcal. This is the Megicano from Acalino. I'm really glad that you guys are going to be able to try this, particularly because of Acalino's passing. Every opportunity to get to try something that Acalino made is really something pretty special. This was always kind of one of our family favorites, one of Acalino's favorites. We really love to pair this particular expression of mezcal with desserts, kind of drier cocoa, like a flourless chocolate tort or something like that. Maybe like a kind of a mint chocolate chip ice cream or something, because this has really beautiful dried baking spice notes on the back end, a little bit of mintiness, maybe like a sweet menthol quality, eucalyptus.
Absolutely.
Really nice white garden flower up front on the nose. Think about like gardenias, peonies, things like that. Really just wonderful floral qualities on the nose, and then a little bit of sweet vegetal in the mid palate, kind of drifting into that baking spice, dry cocoa coffee accents on the back end.
This is something else. There's a lot going on
I
with this
love,
mezcal.
I love the finish. I love the whole
I
thing.
think one of the most delicate, so you really have to like think about it for a second, really pay attention to what you're tasting, because there's things that it's very easy to miss because I think it's a light, delicate profile. But once you really focus and hone in on it, you just start to uncover all these secondary and tertiary notes, especially on the back end. Once you start to exhale and you kind of pick up that stuff in the back of your palate, it's really just a fascinating, fun mezcal to sip on.
Yeah.
Another one that, you know, that just disguises the proof so well, that 51% proof. If anything, it just kind of separates into more layers for me. There's so many distinct layers all the way across the palate. This is something else, man. Really.
Yeah. Really well structured.
Let's see here. And then next up is the Tobala from Amygdio.
Oh,
Tobala is this guy right here, part of the Potatorum family, spelled potato rum. Can take up to 20 years to mature. Really sought after and very famous in mezcal culture. There's literally songs about mezcal produced from this type of agave. Really small plants, kind of like the Megicano. Both tend to weigh like 60, 70 pounds once they're harvested, whereas something like an Espadine can weigh 150 to 200 pounds. Some of the larger agave, like Arauqueños, Blancos, can weigh up to 1,000 pounds. So pretty small plant, low starch content. They don't produce that's very rare for them to produce any pups. So they tend not to grow very close to each other. They really grow all over the place. And you really have to spend a lot of time harvesting them because they like really well-drained soil. So that usually means that they're on pretty steep slopes with rocky soil. So it can be a pain in the butt to harvest them all. But they have really long finishes, a lot of kind of honey, a little bit of the mint quality that we were talking about. I get some tropical fruit notes from Amygdio's mezcal, particularly maybe some marjoram and thyme, kind of herbal qualities. And on the back end, a little bit of that minerality, granite, kind of sea air brininess that we were talking about because of that river water or because of that well water that Amygdio is using.
I've always heard that Tobala agaves don't really take to agronomy or farming very well, and that's part of the reason that it's become such a rare variety. Is it's really hard to, you can't just plant it and grow it yourself. Is there any truth to that?
Yes and no. You can harvest them. I mean, you know, one of the pictures that we looked at earlier was that hillside of 4,000 Tobala plants that Theo Ray had harvested, right? So you have to get the conditions right, and you have to pay attention to what you're doing. That being said, it doesn't mean that it can be done, but it is difficult. It's not easy, but you can do it. Theo Ray has actually already produced mezcal from Tobala agave that he had planted 20 some years ago.
Wow.
So Theo Ray has done a great job of it.
Theo Ray,
Amygdio, Aquilino, or I guess now Temon Mateo, excuse me, they are all actively cultivating Tobala plants. So that's changing. It's evolving. Historically, it was very difficult to do. And also, you know, again, they didn't produce a lot of clones, so it wasn't a very efficient process either. But more and more people are seeing the value in it and taking a little bit more time and putting a little bit more attention to it.
I love this. It's got this minty and then like this salinity to it. You know, you had said kind of granity, I guess. This is a wild tasting mezcal, man. It's so fat too.
Floral on the nose.
So many. It sounds like it would be conflicting flavors, but it all works. It's so awesome.
That's one of the cool things about the categories. You get that a lot. Like you said, kind of you would think conflicting flavors, but somehow they all manage to meld together harmoniously.
Man, awesome.
These are some of the other agaves. So this is Agave Americana. I mentioned Agave Coyote, or I mentioned Agave Arauqueño, which is this guy here. Part of the Americana family, but a different sub-variety. So is Agave Coyote. So this is also an Americana, but takes much less time, much smaller plants, tends to be a little bit sweeter, has kind of a baking spice note. Arroqueño can take up to 20 years. These guys can weigh like 300, 400 pounds once we've actually harvested the agave, the ripe piñas. Tends to have a little bit more of an acidic profile to it. Really nice kind of tartness. This is Tepestate, part of the Marmorada family. Can take up to 35 years to mature in the wild, is what a lot of people say. Although Acalino says that he could cultivate it in 7 to 8 years. So that's a pretty wide range of maturity times here. Much like Megicano, a lot of floral qualities to it. Tepestate is one of the agave that you can smell it in the glass. And regardless really of who's producing it or where they're producing it, you're going to know that it's a Tepestate. And I wanted to show you guys all of these different types of agave because the last one that we're going to sip on this evening is the Ensamble en Barro, which is one of my personal favorites because you never get the same experience twice. So I mentioned earlier that Tío Rey doesn't produce a lot of 100% Espaline, right? Typically what he's doing is a field blend, which we call Ensamble. So he's harvesting a variety of different agave. Sometimes it's only 2, sometimes it's 3. I've seen him make batches with as many as 6 or 7 types of agave, all blended together, harvested at the same time, roasted at the same time, crushed together, co-fermented, and distilled as a single batch of mezcal. And he never repeats the same recipe twice in a row, if ever. So every single batch is going to be unique. So that's why I was talking about earlier, is it's fun to see people come back to the store to look for a bottle of the Ensamble, and then it's going to be a different experience for them. That being said, it's the same producer, the same location, and the same method. So the overall profile is somewhat consistent, but the nuance of it is going to be unique to that particular batch. So you can line up 4 or 5 different Ensamble en Barros. You're going to see a little bit of differentiation from batch to batch, which is a really, really fun experience. Hand crushed again, clay pot distillation and distilled to proof, just a blend of different agave that based on whatever was ripe at that particular moment that he was making that particular batch.
Authenticity, complexity, minuscule bottle count.
It changes every time.
This is
he's got
everything everybody wants.
Everything that I've ever wanted is right here. It's amazing. We are gigantic fans of Tío Rey. If you haven't figured that out yet, me
too, man. He's awesome.
We enjoy having you on, but next time you got to bring Tío Rey.
Oh, please. Or bring him to visit.
That's going to be hard, man. You know what? Because Tío Rey is probably the most camera shy producer that we work with. He doesn't even like to go to Oaxaca City. He really is absolutely just a man of the mountains. He loves being on his farm. He loves being on the ranch. He hates going to Oaxaca City. He's more than welcome. He's more than happy to have people come and visit him. But it takes a lot of convincing to get him to go to Oaxaca City with you.
I mean, if I lived up in the mountains and had a distillery at my house, I probably wouldn't leave either.
Yeah.
There's really no reason
I made mezcal that tasted like this. There's no need to go anywhere.
The last thing I wanted to touch on this evening is kind of who I consider to be our 6th producer, if you will, and that is my friend Eric Rodriguez. He's a really, really wonderful artisan based in a village called San Agustin Etla, which is about an hour north of Oaxaca City. We load up all of our spent agave fiber in the back of a truck. We drive it out to Eric, and he takes about a week to break it down into pulp, reconstitute it into a paste, turn it into this really wonderful paper, uses these natural dye techniques to get all of our labels. And then every single one of our labels has been produced from has been used for mezcal production at one point or another. And there's a really wonderful little article on our blog, masmezcal.com, that goes in depth. You could just use the search function and look for labels. And there's a really wonderful article there about Eric and his entire process.
Yeah, great website. A lot of great info on your website. I encourage everybody to give it a visit.
So, these are just some of the things that we recommend. I encourage people to experience mezcal in their own way. But a lot of people, one of the most common questions I get, particularly from consumers, and it's pretty understandable, is, well, how should I drink this, right? And the right answer is however you enjoy it most. But the way that we recommend is usually a neat pour. You can go to a bar typically and ask them to do like a half pour of a few different mezcals or a flight, with a little half a beer on the side or something like that. The cocktail, I guess, creativity that is coming out with a lot with different agave spirits, whether it be mezcal, tequila, raicilla, bacanora, or the pseudo agave sotol. Really just fascinating cocktail profiles coming out. And as people kind of grow into their home cocktail programs themselves, I would imagine that a lot of home bartenders got leveled up quite a bit over the last year or so, I would have to imagine. So I'm sure people are coming up with some really creative home cocktails with agave spirits. And then I kind of mentioned before slightly pairing things with cuisines, not just with Oaxacan cuisine, but other Mexican cuisine from other parts of Mexico, or other parts of the world. Japanese food, I find, whether it be something like sushi with the Amygdio's mezcals, or izakaya, kind of Japanese pub food with a lot of that umami profile, does really, really well with Tio Rey's mezcals. Also Joel Barriga's mezcals. Also, I really like to see, I really like to see like game meats, like whether it be venison or rabbit, or just richer meats, lamb, goat, etc. Those richer meats tend to pair up and stand up really well with something from Tio Rey with a little bit more of the savory, nutty quality to it. Because Tio Rey's mezcals tend to have almost like a cured meat quality to them that I really, really love, especially when you're pairing them with a savory dish. So that's a really good way to go. But I mean, the world's your oyster, man. Whatever way you want to spend your money and enjoy that particular mezcal, I encourage people to pursue that. Whatever's going to make you appreciate the category more, I'm all about.
Hell yeah.
And then lastly, I'm just going to give you all a few more resources. I mentioned the blog. There's a really wonderful documentary out there, Agave, the Spirit of a Nation, on Vimeo and Amazon. It features 3 agave spirits producers. One of them is Carlos Camarena from La Alteña Distillery, who produces Tapatio, El Tesoro, and Tequila Ocho, our sister brand. There's also Graciela Angeles from Mezcal Real Minero in Santa Catarina, Minas. And then the third producer that was featured was Acalino. So I feel very lucky that Acalino was featured in that film before he passed. So it's a way for his kind of philosophy and his personality to live on and continue to reach people. It's a really wonderful film that talks about family and how agave spirits fit into family for each one of those particular producers. Mezcalistas.com and mezcalreviews.com. Mezcalistas is a blog about mezcal in general, and mezcalreviews.com is just, they have tasting notes and reviews for any mezcal that you could imagine, essentially. And these 3 books here are really kind of great 101, 102, and kind of 201 level books to learn about the category. And that's all I have
Nice.
for you.
Thank you for sharing those.
The full hour. So if anybody has any questions or anything, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, y'all please carry on your evening and enjoy some mezcals.
Yeah. Anybody have any other questions for Cisco before I let him go here? And it's always great having you on this. Brett says hello. He's judging ADI out in California this week. Jay and Karen, this has been so informative. Thank you, Jay and Karen, for joining us again. I know we got some regulars here. So Monique said hi too on the Facebook feed. So.
Monique, I'll have to shoot her.
Yeah. So Cisco, thanks again, man. We appreciate it. Hopefully we get back to, we're very close to having in-person stuff again instead of, spitting in cups virtually. So.
Absolutely, man. It was a blast when I joined you guys in person a couple years ago, and I look forward to doing it again. If anybody has any questions about the brand, mezcal in general, please let me know. Mezcal Francisco is my email. Oh, and I also, how could I forget this? If you go to YouTube and look up the Agave sessions, for about probably 9 months, I was doing essentially weekly video podcasts about just agave in general. Had people on from different brands, different agave spirits categories, whether it was Raicilla or Bacanora or whatever, ecologists, conservationists, all people who are kind of tangential to mezcal culture. So if you want to go down that rabbit hole, I highly, highly encourage you to check out the agave sessions. It was a lot of fun.
Man, 9 months. I'm never going to complain about Brett making us talk about agave for 8 weeks ever again.
8 weeks.
I haven't done it for a few months. I need to get back on it. It was a lot of fun.
All right, cool. We're definitely going to check those out. Everybody else, we'll be back. I'm going to be doing some tequila cocktails on Friday with a flavored tequila brand. And then next week, what do we have next week? I don't think anybody. Oh, no, we have Templeton Rye next Friday. And then David Stewart, the malt master at Balvenie on Saturday. So yeah, virtual tastings, book through the end of the month. Check out bennies.com/virtual tastings. Cisco, thanks again, man. We really appreciate your time tonight. And we appreciate these.
Thank you, everyone. We will see you all around.
All right. See everybody soon. Cheers.